Welcome back. Former President Jacob Zuma's corruption trial is due to resume in the Pietermaritzburg High Court today. Now, the court will hear his special plea hearing for the recusal of State Prosecutor Downer, who Zuma claims is biased against him. Now, the former president and French arms company Thales have pleaded not guilty to charges of racketeering, corruption, money laundering and fraud as part of South Africa's 1999 multi-billion rand arms deal contracts. The application has been postponed twice already since August due to the former president's ill health. Now, he's currently on medical parole after being sentenced to 15 months in prison for contempt of court on a separate charge, or rather in a separate case. Now, to give us a legal perspective of what is expected in today's court proceedings, we're joined by Karyn Maughan, a News 24 legal journalist. Karyn, good morning and thanks for speaking to us.
Thanks for having me.
So, former President Jacob Zuma's special plea hearing, this of course to they remove the National Prosecuting Authority's prosecutor, Advocate Downer. That is what we're focusing on today and tomorrow. This, of course, so that a state-appointed medical team of specialists in cooperation with Zuma's own medical team could consider his medical evidence on his fitness to stand trial. So I know that's a lot, but of course, let's start there. And how significant is today's court proceedings in determining how this trial proceeds?
Well, absolutely. You are 100% correct. There are two distinct processes happening here. The first, of course, is in relation to the former president's health. We know that his doctors had submitted letters or correspondence to the Department of Correctional Services and the NPA stating that he would potentially require treatment of up to 6 months for an undisclosed medical ailment or situation. We know, of course, that he was recently released on medical parole on the basis that he was unable to take care of himself. That was 14 days ago. That decision itself now under legal review. So, major question marks at this point as to even if he's going to arrive at court today. I spoke to the spokesperson for his foundation, Mzwanele Manye, yesterday, and his words were, well, your guess is as good as mine. So there are question marks over this issue of a potential long postponement being sought by the former head of state. At this point, no confirmation about if he is indeed going to seek to do that through his lawyers. Separate to that, as you rightly point out, he is bringing an application to challenge the title not only of Downer, but actually the entire National Prosecuting Authority to prosecute him for corruption, racketeering, and arms deal related to the arms deal of the late 1990s and early 2000s. And he's essentially saying that because of various prosecutorial abuses, which he says he's been subjected to, the entire NPA and Downer, who he targets in on, simply lack the impartiality and to prosecute and independence to prosecute him appropriately, and therefore Downer should be removed, and additional to that, he should be acquitted of all the charges that he currently faces.
So with regard to Downer's recusal, how difficult is it going to be to prove that, Karyn, as the former president alleges, that the prosecutor is biased against him? I would imagine that's going to take some doing.
Well, what's interesting, of course, is that he has suggested through his lawyers and made it very clear through his lawyers that if this special plea persists, he will seek to get Downer to testify amongst many other officials. He himself has suggested through his lawyer that he may well take the stand. But, we have no legal precedent for a case in which a prosecutor has been removed and it has resulted in the acquittal of the accused person. Certainly in relation to some of the other cases that have involved this issue of potential conflict or bias, the prosecutor was not... there were decisions, the removal of the prosecutor, or potential removal of the prosecutor, the courts found, was not a basis for an acquittal of the accused person. So certainly relief that the former president is seeking in terms of his acquittal and his argument that no one should be allowed to prosecute him certainly is extraordinary. And it's I would venture to say incredibly doubtful that he will actually succeed in that particular argument. In terms of his attacks on Downer and the state, pretty much everything that he said, apart from some averments about Leonard McCarthy, was the former head of the Scorpions, potentially being linked to the CIA, have all been ventilated in other court processes, and those courts not really finding substantive evidence that what he has alleged would form the basis of, for example, of a permanent stay of prosecution, which the court in 2019 refused the former head of state. Now, his lawyers say that's absolutely irrelevant, that this process now is very distinct from that. But what the state is arguing is essentially all of these matters have been decided before. We actually just need to progress with this trial, and Jacob Zuma needs to answer to the charges against him.
So, Karyn, last month, the court ordered that the state may appoint a medical practitioner of its own choice to examine the former president. And if necessary, that medical practitioner could give evidence as to the former president's fitness to attend court and stand trial. But then we know subsequent developments where the former president is now out on medical parole on a separate case. So, in terms of the former president's current state of health, how does this complicate the state's case against him?
I think that's an excellent question. I think that the state is obviously going to be observing what happened in terms of the medical parole situation, which is currently, the subject of legal review by, amongst other people, the DA, AfriForum, and others, and take a potential, take cognizance of that. It's important to remember that we know from the Commissioner of Correctional Services that the Medical Parole Advisory Board itself did not believe that, did not recommend the former president's release, and felt that because his condition was stable, which was the word that Fraser used, it was not justified to release him on medical parole, which of course requires that you're either terminally ill, physically incapacitated, or unable to take care of yourself. So, the kind of controversy over that is very much going to bleed into this case, even if it doesn't necessarily do so in a legal way. Because I think if the former president arrives at court this morning, it's going to again raise serious questions about whether that decision by Fraser was in fact sound, because, it's given on a basis that someone is really in very, very serious ill health. That being said, we may, and the former president, when he opposed a virtual hearing of this special plea, made it very clear that he did not want to do so. He didn't want to participate in the case while he was in prison. So it remains unclear if his ill health is of such a dire nature that he does not appear today. I'm not sure if this case can necessarily progress, given that he's been so vehement about the fact that he needs to be in the courtroom for this argument, to go ahead without jeopardizing his fair trial rights. We know that there was meant to be a meeting between the doctors for the state and the military doctors who look after Jacob Zuma about the report that they have produced on his health and its implications for his fitness to stand trial. We don't know, it does not appear at this stage whether the NPA appointed doctors have been allowed to examine him, and indeed whether the NPA is satisfied with the report produced by the military doctors. All of these issues are expected to be ventilated in the court this morning. And I think it's going to, be one way or another, we are going to get a sense of just how this corruption case may play out in light of the former president's state of health, and also in light of his ongoing efforts to stop the entire NPA from persisting with the prosecution against him.
So quite a few variables still up in the air, Karyn. As you say, we don't know whether the state-appointed medical examiners have had access to the former president and whether he will actually accede to that medical examination to begin with. But that being as it may, what happens should the state's medical experts find that Zuma is in fact fit and able to stand trial? It's one of those variables, one scenario. Do you see this being contested by his lawyers in that particular instance? How is this going to work? Because we would also, of course, have to hear from the former president's own medical team.
Well, we don't. If the former president's lawyers elect to bring a long postponement application and they say, listen, at this point, based on these previous assertions that were made by his military doctors that he required 6 months of treatment and that he had a condition that he'd had for 18 months but now required urgent medical intervention. We also saw from the Department of Correctional Services that he was hospitalized initially for observation, but that subsequently it emerged that he required emergency procedures, that have not been disclosed. If the lawyers for Jacob Zuma come forward and say, listen, at this point, he is actually unable to stand in the dock. We don't believe that he's fit to stand trial, and we want to bring an application for a long postponement, for potentially up to 6 months. Now, these are all scenarios. We don't know if this is indeed what's going to happen. But if they do that, the state can then, if it disagrees with that particular, assessment by his military doctors that indeed he requires the 6 months of treatment and is unfit to stand trial, they have the ability those doctors can then be called to testify and they can cross-examine them. The difficulty, of course, is that we don't know whether or not their doctors have been, in those circumstances, have been able to examine the former president. So that puts them on a bit of a back foot in terms of leading their own evidence, challenging the evidence of the military doctors. And that's why, it's so crucial that there must be some form of agreement or, between these two sets of doctors over the state of health of the former president. If there are question marks that are not properly answered, if the state's doctors are not satisfied with the evidence or the report that's been provided by the military doctors, if they feel or the NPA feels that they have not been properly allowed to have the examination that the former president's lawyers agreed to in court and was made in order of court, then that this entire aspect of the case becomes problematic. Because, we've seen legal commentators coming out and saying that potentially the former president would be in contempt of court if he refused to be examined by the NPA doctors. And certainly given the other, medical parole process where it seems that he was examined by his non-military doctors as part of that process, it then becomes somewhat complicated. So today's hearing this morning is incredibly important, just in terms of us gaining some form of clarity as to what the position is, not only from Jacob Zuma's military doctors, but indeed from the NPA. And if they aren't satisfied with the responses, with the evidence, with the report, with their access to the former head of state, what do they then do? What do they propose as a way forward?
And of course, Karyn, one of the questions that has been, top of mind, given the medical parole for the former president, is can the court divulge his medical details without violating the former president's right to privacy and his right to health care?
I think that if there is a scenario in which medical evidence is led and the evidence of these doctors is provided and cross-examined, that aspect of the case will be heard in camera. So there will not be, we won't be broadcasting that. The journalist in the courtroom will be asked to leave and all the cameras will be shut off. So if that application goes ahead and his military doctors are called to testify, I don't think there's any way that hearing will actually be open to the public.
And then, Karyn, does the NPA have a watertight case here against Zuma? And what will the removal of prosecutor Billy Downer in the event that the former president's legal team succeeds in that, hypothetically speaking, what will that have and what will it mean for the case of the NPA?
Well, Downer's gone on affidavit and said that should he be removed, there were other prosecutors who he had worked with who could take on the case. He, of course, says there's absolutely no legal basis for it. But that's why Zuma's insistence that the entire NPA, that the prosecutors who's worked with Downer, that people like Wim Trengrove and Andrew Breitenbach, who've been private counsel for the state, he's essentially saying that none of them can prosecute him, that the NPA itself lacks the title to prosecute him, which is extraordinary relief. But in the event that Downer is removed, he remains adamant that other prosecutors can persist with the case against him. The state has recently suffered another blow in the death of Johan van der Walt, who was the KPMG auditor at the time, who did that detailed forensic report or investigation into 96,000 documents that were seized from Jacob Zuma and his lawyers in 2005, I think, to form the basis of this very detailed forensic report on Jacob Zuma's finances. He, of course, passed away recently, but the NPA is saying that he had worked with an updated report on another, forensic consultant who is ready and willing to come and testify. But certainly from the state's perspective, given that Johan van der Walt was so integrally involved in the investigation, it may itself not be necessarily opposed to this case. It might not necessarily be not in its interest for this case to be delayed somewhat because of the medical questions over the former president. Though certainly I do think the state will oppose some form of long postponement of this case if it is not satisfied that ample evidence has been led to back up these claims that Jacob Zuma is in fact too sick to stand trial.
Karyn, we're out of time, but I have to ask you, the arms deal, of course, part of this country's history now, and it's been going on, this trial and trying to hold people accountable for many years now. But given that this was a multi-billion rand deal, Jacob Zuma on trial, Thales on trial, do you think this is something that will ever go away? Is this the end of it? Are these the only people who are going to be held accountable?
Well, I mean, this really, and I've said it before many times, is that Jacob Zuma should have been put on trial in 2003 with his former financial advisor, Shabir Sheikh, who was, of course, ultimately convicted of corrupting him. And, the difficulties that we now face with, his medical condition, the fact that he is a 79-year-old, 80-year-old man with medical issues, all of these speak to an attempt to bring about a trial that really should have happened, 18 years ago. I don't think that we are going to see other prosecutions, unfortunately, because the arms deal in many respects is the original sin of our young democracy. Billions of rands that should and had been earmarked for, really dealing with the massive social inequality that this country is still struggling with post-apartheid, post-colonialism, instead of being funneled into a form of, economic redress for the black majority who were left economically and socially devastated by apartheid, was spent on arms and ammunition that we simply didn't need. And I think that continues to haunt us to this day. But whether or not that's going to translate into actual accountability beyond just the Jacob Zuma trial, I think, unfortunately, I don't know that is necessarily going to happen. And I think that this will continue to scar us, in democracy, even 18 years later and beyond.
Well, Karyn Maughan, thank you so much. News 24 legal journalist Karyn Maughan talking to us about the Pietermaritzburg High Court setting aside 2 days to hear former President Jacob Zuma's special plea for the recusal of the National Prosecuting Authority's prosecutor, Advocate Billy Downer, from his corruption trial and to determine if the former president is indeed fit to stand trial. Let's hand you over to Leanne for